Our father was actually born in Mexico and moved to the US for a chance at a better life. There, he met our mother, and they moved to Oklahoma together where they had us and our little sister, Monica. My father was an avid hunter and camper and just an all-around outdoorsy type. We both have wonderful memories of us all camping and even our boys' trips of the three of us hunting. In the early 2000s, my father passed away due to heart complications. We were all devastated as he really was the rock that held us all together, truly a family man. After we all took nearly a year to grieve and feel sorry for ourselves, our mom convinced us that it's not what our father would have wanted. We knew that we needed to move on for him, and that's precisely what we aimed to do. So for the anniversary of his death, we decided to continue his tradition of father-son trips and drive down to Mexico in order to sprinkle some of his ashes in his hometown. Our planning was very meticulous. We knew what essentials to pack and what would just take up space. We took our camping gear expecting to be sleeping under the stars, not in hotels or at least in the back of the truck. We packed a cooler with simple foods to last us in between, as well as another cooler with water and our dad's favorite lemonade, our little splurge. We set out looking forward to a few days away, a chance for us to heal and move on. The trip started out great. We made a few stops in between to sightsee or to rest. We even got into Mexico with little hiccups on the way. We actually found the exact house that our dad used to live in. The people that lived there at the time of our trip even invited us in and told us about how they actually knew our grandfather, which was how they got the house. It was supposed to go to our father, but he agreed with his father to let the family have it as they were in more need of it. Then he was just another show of how selfless our father was. We sprinkled some of his ashes there, and then we planned to go to his favorite fishing spot that he went to with his father. We stayed in Mexico an extra day just to experience it. We went a few times as kids, but it had been so long ago, and we hardly remembered everything and wanted to see it all as adults. After our time in Mexico, we knew that we had to make our way back home. So we packed everything up and prepared to make the way back. We refilled some of our food and water, but they didn't have a lot of options for bottled water where we were at, so we grabbed what we could and said that we would fill up at the next chance we could get. We had tossed our used bottles, not thinking about refilling them, so we were kicking ourselves for that. Anyways, we still had a good amount of supplies, so we thought we would be okay. But what we did not account for were truck problems that would severely throw a wrench into our plans. As we drove and talked, there was suddenly a loud popping sound and the check engine light kicked on. We could hear a weird gurgling sound and we both looked at each other like, what the hell was that? We pulled over to the side of the road and opened the hood to see what happened. The only problem is we weren't exactly mechanically inclined. Our dad tried to teach us some things, but of all the things he tried to get us to do, we just could not grasp the car thing. It just wasn't our thing, and I think he knew that, so he didn't push it much. We knew how to change oil, but that was about it. We looked under the hood and couldn't really see anything immediately wrong. Our initial thought was to drive it slowly with the hazards on to the next town and to call for a tow truck to the closest car shop. As mentioned, this was the early 2000s, and neither of us had cell phones, so we had no way of calling anyone. But when Alfredo went to try to start the truck, it wouldn't turn over at all. All we got was a weak whirring sound and the lights kicking on. That truck was not moving. We were still in Mexico and the road we were on was pretty empty, previously only seeing 2 other cars on it. We both agreed that all we could do was wait for someone to pass and hopefully stop to help us. We just took it as a time to relax. We sat in the bed until we got too hot and then moved into the truck, thinking the shade would help some. However, it soon became too hot in there as well, so we treated it as another night and set up our tent in the field next to the road. We thought we could at least rest and eat, and if anything, maybe a cop would come by to tell us we couldn't stay there and we could get some help. But I guess that was just us being optimistic. There wasn't a single car that drove by that day or through the night, at least while we were awake. We ended up falling asleep without being disturbed once, and we woke up in the same situation that we were in. We considered walking, but we couldn't remember how far away the last stop was. We'd been driving for quite some time, and by foot it was going to take even longer. We once again decided to wait it out, hoping that it was a fresh day, and surely there would be at least one person. It had been hours, and still nobody was around. By midday, the temps had to be in the triple digits, and we had to stay hydrated with how much we were sweating. However, we didn't have a lot of water left. We had 4 bottles between both of us, and even portioning them, we were running low. I made the decision that I had to try to get help somehow. I filled up the empty bottles with the water from the food cooler and put them in the cooler next to Alfredo. I told him I was going to get help, and he didn't really respond. I was worried that I was running out of time. I started walking in the direction that we had come from, and I was only an hour in, according to my watch, and I was already starting to regret it. I was feeling weak and dizzy, and my water was almost gone. I was scared and angry. We just wanted to have a good trip with our dad one last time, and we were still hindered. I stopped to sit on a boulder, trying to calm down, when I heard the rolling sound of wheels on gravel. I looked up and saw an old, rickety truck heading in my direction. I was elated but tried not to get my hopes up. It was possible that they wouldn't stop either, but as I weakly waved them over, they surprisingly did. It was an old man wearing a cowboy hat and overalls with no shirt. He asked if I was all right, and I flatly told him no. I explained what happened, and he told me to hop in the back, and I didn't hesitate. He drove back to where Alfredo was, and I was just thankful for the man and the breeze as he drove. Once we were there, he told me to get my brother in the truck, and he looked at ours. Alfredo was hardly coherent at that point, and he was extremely hot to the touch. The man confirmed that he had a feeling that he knew what was wrong with it, but that it wasn't going to be a quick fix, so he agreed to take us into town. I quickly threw our camping gear into the back of the truck, not giving a damn about the stuff at that point. I just wanted my brother to be okay. The man drove us back to the town that we passed through, and with how long it took us, I don't think that I would have made that walk. The man said that he was actually planning on picking some things up from his sister a few towns over, and he almost didn't because of how hot it was that day. I was just incredibly thankful that he decided to go for whatever reason he did. Once there, I got Alfredo to a clinic who confirmed that he was severely dehydrated. We got fluids and electrolytes in him, and he was back to normal for the most part, other than a migraine and being tired. We stayed there a few more days until we could get our truck towed and fixed at least enough to just get us home. I couldn't thank that man enough for being so generous to us, and I even offered to pay him, but he refused. Thankfully, we were able to get home after that with little problems, and we made sure to have a full pack of water. Even if it was hot, it was better than no water. Looking back, the trip was still enjoyable. I was happy that we were able to get to Mexico with no issues to give our dad a proper send-off, and I feel as though that since he was with us, he was looking out for us that day too. I will be forever grateful for the man that stopped. It was my last year of college, and I was burnt out and exhausted but happy to finally be done. As a congratulatory gift, my boyfriend planned a road trip for the two of us and my best friend Cassidy, whom I hadn't seen in a year due to my schoolwork. She flew down to meet us and stayed for a day so she could look around, as she had never been to Georgia. The next day, we set off on our road trip back to Pennsylvania, where I grew up and where Cassidy was still living, as well as my parents. My boyfriend Grant had seriously planned this all out for me, and I was ecstatic. We all piled into his little car, filling the trunk and the back seat next to Cassidy, and we were on our way. We were making great time, even with the frequent stops to take pictures and bathroom breaks. Grant and I even swapped driving duties so he could stretch out. We stopped at a nice little diner in South Carolina. Cassidy convinced us to stop at an antique store in North Carolina, and ultimately I was glad that we did. Grant found an old game console from his childhood that we purchased, and he looked so elated to find it. We decided to stay at a hotel in North Carolina for the night, since our excitement and energy were making us crash pretty hard. The hotel was fine, nothing too extravagant, but it was clean and in a nice area. The next morning, we went to the free breakfast buffet before leaving. I was in line right behind an older man. He looked like he was probably in his 70s. He was bald, with a very long gray beard, wearing a pair of jeans and a blue and red flannel shirt, with a pair of sunglasses on his head. He asked me if I wanted the tongs for the hot dish he was at, and I confirmed, so he handed them to me. Then, as I went to grab an apple from the covered fruit container at the end, he turned around and said, "Think fast," and stabbed my apple with one of those little drink swords. They had a container of them at the end to help pick up the waffles, I guess. When he did that, he had this big grin on his face. I was taken aback and just smiled awkwardly, not really sure how to react. He walked away chuckling to himself, and I grabbed another apple, this time successfully without any interruptions. I sat down with Grant and Cassidy and told them what had happened. Cassidy said she thought she saw the man when we came down, but Grant did not. I explained what happened, but when I went to point him out, he was already gone. It wasn't a big deal, though. I figured he just took his food back to his room. We got back on the road after filling our stomachs, ready for another great day. However, we did not fill up our tanks, so after a few hours we had to stop for gas. Grant said he needed to use the restroom, so I agreed to fill up while they went in and got us drinks. I finished fueling, and after we stretched, Cassidy and I got back in the car and waited for Grant to come out, which he did shortly after. Grant then told us the guy working behind the counter had told him about a small museum about the state that wasn't too far away from where we were, and asked if we wanted to go. I love learning about new places, especially ones I've never been to, so I was up for it. We got to the museum and had a good time. There was nothing wrong with it, and we got a souvenir, but nothing too crazy happened. It wasn't until later that night that things started to get weird. I have to give a bit of a rundown of what happened so far on the trip, so the rest of this will make sense. We took the day a bit slower since we were still on time, and by the time we were in Virginia, it was pretty dark out. I was driving and getting tired, but we were planning on stopping at the next exit that had hotels. When I started to get tired, I hyper-focus on my surroundings. I don't know if it's a way to prevent me from falling asleep or what, but it's what I do, and it's definitely helped. But as we drove and our chatter slowly died down, I focused on the surroundings outside. We were passing through a section of highway that was pretty empty. The road was pretty flat, and there were fields on both sides, some kind of farm it seemed. I saw a sign for the exit coming soon, so I started to slow down, preparing to get over, not wanting to miss my exit. As I started to slow down, I could see a dark figure in the distance to the right of us. As we got closer, I was able to make out the shape of a person. There was a person standing on the side of the highway in the middle of the night. But the only thing was, there wasn't a car in sight. There wasn't a one on the side of the road, so seeing this guy completely alone was bizarre, and I started to slow down even more. No, I'm not the type to pick up a hitchhiker, especially in the middle of nowhere, but I was curious if he was okay and what exactly he was doing there. Grant was still awake at this point with me, so we were both looking at this guy. As we got closer, our speed was nearly at a crawl until we were a few feet from him. Grant then suddenly said, "What the hell?" but I didn't know why. I just kept driving. That wasn't until we got in front of him. I was at a loss for words. The man standing there was the same guy from the hotel in North Carolina, the man that had stabbed at my apple. At least it looked identical to him. He had on the jeans and flannel shirt, was bald, had a long gray beard, and his sunglasses were even sitting on his head still. He was holding what looked like some kind of rake. I was at nearly a crawl trying to look at this guy. Grant was really focused on him too, considering he was on his side and could see him even better than I could. I mentioned that he looked like the guy from the hotel, and Grant quickly said, "Drive, don't stop, just drive." The way he said it scared the hell out of me, so I gunned it to the exit and got off the highway. We stopped at some hotel, and I asked him what the hell that was about, trying to see if maybe he saw something I didn't. He asked me again about the guy from the hotel, and I described him, explaining how he looked just like him. The color from his face drained, and he told me that's exactly what the guy looked like at the gas station that we stopped at. I tried to be reasonable. He definitely looked just like the man from the hotel that Grant did not see, but I also didn't see the attendant at the gas station. Grant had no reason to lie about his description. In fact, he seemed more disturbed by the man on the side of the road than I did, so I can't see him doing all that just to freak me out. We both agreed that it had to be some kind of crazy coincidence and woke up Cassidy so we could get into the hotel. We got into our room and also explained what happened to Cass, and she agreed that it was bizarre, but otherwise we all kind of just dropped it. The hotel wasn't anything spectacular. We wanted a place to rest and shower, so the quick continental breakfast was welcoming too. We were back on the road and back to enjoying ourselves along the way, talking, laughing, and singing. There was apparently one planned stop close to the border of West Virginia and Pennsylvania, something that Grant specifically wanted to check out. We were kind of torn at that point in our trip. We were contemplating just driving the rest of the way home or if we should stop again. It would be earlier, so we would have the day to do whatever we wanted. We agreed to stay, and that way we didn't push ourselves either. We stopped at a restaurant for an early dinner and looked up some hotels in the area and made our choice. We picked a pretty popular looking hotel. The price was decent and the rooms looked clean. They also had free breakfast and a pool. We tried to keep it cheap, but we also wanted to be able to enjoy ourselves. Anyways, we left the restaurant and headed for the hotel, ready to take a dip or maybe a nap. But once we walked to the front desk, I was immediately in panic mode. Standing behind the desk was the same man from the gas station, from the field, from the last hotel. It was the same bald man with a beard, sunglasses, a flannel shirt, and jeans. He even smiled at us. It was the kind of smile of familiarity, like when you recognize someone. When we all noticed him, we looked at each other as if trying to determine if what we were seeing was real. Again, Cass saw him from the first hotel, so now we had all seen him in multiple places. How was this possible? There was no way he could have been following us. Most of our trip was unplanned, and sometimes we were ahead, sometimes behind. The guy was nice, asking us about a room and making small talk. He asked where we were coming from and where we were going, and I couldn't speak. Grant said we were from Georgia, but just said that we didn't have a destination yet. I could tell that Grant was suspicious too. Cassidy then jumped in and asked if he was from another state, and he laughed and said no, saying he'd lived in Pennsylvania all his life. We checked in and quickly walked up to our room, not talking until we were in there. We all discussed what happened, and nobody had an explanation. The guy even remembered me from the first hotel. There was no way it was the same guy. There had to be an explanation. It was late, so we decided to stay. The entire night we all had difficulty sleeping. I was constantly on edge. I tried looking up some kind of explanation, but I got nothing. The next morning we woke up early and just left, not bothering with breakfast. We were back on the road for the last part of our journey. We weren't too far from home, and now we just wanted to get there. It wasn't until that last part that I thought about something the guy had said. He mentioned he had lived in Pennsylvania all his life. I asked Cassidy if maybe she had seen someone similar and just thought they looked the same, but she didn't think so. Grant was the same way. There had to be something weird going on, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I just wanted to get home and not think about it anymore. We made it to my parents' house that afternoon. I didn't tell them what had happened since it just seemed too bizarre. We spent the next few days relaxing and catching up, which made me feel better. The whole situation with the man was in the back of my mind, but it wasn't something I wanted to focus on. I was sitting in the living room with Grant and Cassidy a few days later, watching TV. We were just lounging around, and I was flipping through channels, and that's when I saw him again. The man with the beard, the sunglasses, and the flannel shirt. He was on the TV, and I was shocked. It was a news segment about a missing person. The news anchor said his name was Tom Jackson, and he had been missing for a few days. He was last seen in North Carolina, but there were reports of sightings in other states. I didn't know what to think. I told Grant and Cassidy to look, and we all just stared at the TV, trying to process what we were seeing. How could this be the same man we had seen multiple times during our trip? I felt a chill run down my spine. The whole situation was too strange to ignore, but there was nothing we could do. We called the police and told them about our encounters with the man, hoping it would help in some way. They took our statement and said they would look into it. To this day, I don't know what really happened. We never heard back from the police, and the case eventually went cold. The memory of that trip still haunts me, and I can't help but wonder if we were being followed or if it was just some bizarre coincidence. Either way, it's a story I will never forget. It was late July, and my girlfriend Teresa and I were taking a road trip to see some friends on the West Coast. They were getting married, and with the amount of stuff Teresa was going to need to take, it was ultimately going to be cheaper to just drive. So we made our own little road trip out of it. We were both pretty excited about it and hardly slept the night before. We hadn't been able to go on vacation for a few years, so we were ready for some much needed time away. Because of this, we actually got up pretty early, packed up the car, and went to have breakfast before heading out. As we got further north, the surroundings became more rural and isolated. We were driving on a road surrounded by towering trees and winding areas. It was gorgeous, don't get me wrong, but it was also eerie. The trees made us look so small and insignificant, not to mention the lack of reception on these roads. Still, the experience was worth it, and by the number of pictures Teresa took, I could tell that she enjoyed it too. The only issue I had was that I was going to need to stop for gas soon. I wasn't expecting to drive through the trees to be that long, otherwise I would have stopped beforehand. Thankfully, it did seem that the state knew this was a long stretch, and we spotted a sign for gas and food coming up. So we continued on, knowing we had a planned stop and we would be in good hands. As we approached where the gas station was supposed to be, we nearly passed it because of how run down it looked. There was a small building with the siding, or whatever it was, peeling away from the wall. From the small window in the front of the building, it looked dark in there, like it wasn't even open. The single pump itself looked ancient, like something straight out of a 1950s movie, complete with a rusty sign and analog numbers on the pump. At first I was concerned that it wouldn't even work, but as I approached it, it had signs of having been recently used. However, the handle seemed to be locked behind some kind of chain and key lock. I looked around, wondering if maybe some kind of attendant had to pump the gas. I wasn't familiar with the area, so I didn't know if that was a thing at the time. After Teresa and I looked around from our car and contemplated if we could make it to another gas station, we heard a gravelly voice say, "Needing gas?" We looked up and saw a man standing next to the building, as if he had just come around from the back or side of the building. He was wearing some very dirty jeans. They had dark patches of dirt all over them, as well as his once white t-shirt. It had spots of dark brown to gold stains on it. In this area, I assumed that it was normal for someone to look a bit disheveled from working outside all day. We both agreed that we didn't have a choice, so we told him yes, and he nodded, walking over to unlock the pump. He said the card reader was broken and asked for cash. I gave him some money, and he filled up the tank. I couldn't help but feel uneasy the entire time. Once we were back on the road, Teresa and I both admitted that the man in the place creeped us out. We managed to get back on track with no further issues and arrived at our destination safely. However, the memory of that gas station and the strange man still lingers in my mind. We always make sure to plan our stops better now to avoid any such unsettling experiences in the future. I used to be an OTR truck driver driving with another guy. This job only lasted a year, but within that year, I had some strange encounters on the road. Despite some of the weird people, there was one guy that creeped me out more than anyone else. He's one of the main reasons I stopped driving in the first place. The interaction happened at night. We were driving a load down to California, set to arrive the next day. That night, I arrived at a rest area in Arkansas at about 3:30 a.m. I had just finished my drive time and was set to take my 10-hour break. It was dark with light rain, and the rest area was down a bit from the highway and completely encircled by trees, creating a perfect spooky atmosphere. I clocked out for the night, did a quick scan around, and hopped out and locked the truck. The rest area was pretty quiet, with a few sparse cars in the parking lot and a couple of semis that decided to sleep there for the night. There were benches around with some canopies over them to shield them from the rain. As I was walking to the restroom, I saw a man in the dark, smoking a cigarette and sitting on one of the benches. Walking past him raised my anxiety a bit, but not enough to set off an alarm. I handled my business, washed my hands, and then headed back to the truck. The man was still seated in his original spot, but his body language told me he was now watching me. His face was shrouded in a shadow due to the overhead light, but his whole body turned as I walked past. Getting slightly paranoid, I picked up my pace back to the truck, finally hopped inside and quickly locked the door. Figuring the worst of my anxiety was over, I turned the radio back on to finish one of the comedy shows I was listening to and started eating some beef jerky. As I raised the jerky to my mouth, my peripheral vision sensed some movement. I looked up at the benches, but the man was no longer sitting there. He was now perched underneath the light post about 10 feet from my truck. My anxiety flooded back, and I sensed something was off. Something about his posture bothered me, like I could sense he didn't have good intentions. I shut the radio off and stared back. This guy didn't move at all. The shadows covered most of his face, but I could tell he was staring at me. The stare down felt like it lasted for 10 minutes straight. He didn't even lift his arm to take a drag from his cigarette that was still lit. Feeling like the situation was too strange, I called my co-driver, who was sleeping in the cab. "Hey man, I finished my shift, but there's this dude staring at me from outside the truck," I said. He peeked through the cab curtain and said, "What dude?" I looked back and the guy was gone. I freaked out, scanning all over, and when I looked in the driver's side mirror, I saw him walking slowly towards the back of the truck with a cigarette in his mouth. "He's walking around the truck," I said. My co-driver finally saw him in the passenger side mirror. The guy stopped right by the door and started peering into the lower window of the passenger door. Freaked out, I yelled, "What do you want, asshole?" Which made the man leap back and step on his tiptoes to try and peer into the higher window. He could see me looking at him now. He had to be in his 50s, a very skinny man with bright blue, bugged-out eyes, and a deranged look on his face. My co-driver said, "Can we help you?" Upon hearing there were two of us in the truck, the man abruptly straightened up and walked off, leaving both of us confused. We noticed that every time a new vehicle arrived, he would walk to the nearest light post and stand there. We sat for about 30 minutes, debating whether we should call the police since this guy didn't technically do anything besides act like a creep. When we finally decided to call, we watched the man check his phone, shake his hands in frustration, sprint back to one of the cars in the parking lot, and peel off into the night. What confuses me the most is what his intentions were. If it came down to an altercation, I was quite bigger than he was, so he'd only have the upper hand if he had a weapon. If he planned to steal the truck, we have logs and GPS coordinates on our truck at all times. Our systems alert our fleet manager if we're driving off when we have no time on our clocks. Plus, what was he doing out at 3:30 a.m. in a shady rest area? My best theory is that rest areas aren't watched very often by police, and this one happened to be out of view due to the tree coverage between the rest area and the highway. This guy seemed to have picked this spot for that particular reason. As for what plans he had: abduction, theft, violence, it's not clear. About 6 years ago, I was with my friend Tom at my parents' cabin. We decided to head off to a casino located in an Ojibwe reserve about 40 minutes away. The entire stretch of highway between is heavily forested and has no lights, meaning it can get incredibly dark. We got there, played some poker, tried a few table games, and even grabbed some dinner with our winnings. It was a pretty successful night overall. We ended up leaving the casino around 1 a.m., a little later than I would have liked given the lack of streetlights. We drove for about 20 minutes on the highway without passing any other vehicles when I noticed two green orbs just off the highway before a hill. Realizing it was a deer, I slammed on the brakes and waited for several deer to cross, then resumed driving. As soon as we made the crest of the hill, Tom screamed, "Holy shit!" Right in front of us was a young woman walking in the middle of our lane towards us, no more than maybe 30 feet away. I slammed on the brakes again, coming within 10 feet of her. Thankfully, slowing down earlier and climbing the hill meant we weren't going as fast. What was going through my mind wasn't that I nearly ran someone over, but that this young woman with pitch black hair was wearing a white nightgown with no shoes and was still walking towards us with a blank, expressionless face. I'm not going to lie, that image frightened me because it looked like something straight out of a horror movie. Tom and I waited to see if she was going to come up to our window and maybe ask for help or something. She made it to the front of my car, then went around the driver's side, raising her hand and dragging it across the side of my car while continuing her walk. At this point, Tom and I were both pretty freaked out. I asked Tom what we should do. He said we should just get out of there, but for whatever reason, I didn't feel right about leaving and not asking if she was all right. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw that she was still walking, Having almost hit her and knowing that something just wasn't right, I decided to do something. I told Tom I was going to ask if she was okay, but he pleaded that we just go. I put on some bravery and told him not to worry, that I would be right back. I put on my hazard lights and stepped out of my car. I left my door open to provide some light and walked around to the trunk of my car. The interior lights didn't do much, but they allowed me to see an outline of her slightly down the hill. Only able to see her every other second, I half yelled, "Hey, are you all right?" She finally stopped walking but faced the other way, with no response. I then heard Tom's door open as he was getting out to join me. Suddenly she started screaming. Tom and I both ran back into my car, and I just floored it. I got a lot of shit from Tom for the remainder of the ride back to the cabin. I haven't seen or heard anything like that on the highway since then, and I'm pretty thankful for it. That was the creepiest moment of my life. This past September, I took a road trip down to Myrtle Beach with my family. It was myself, my mother, my sister, her husband, and their 2 kids. We used my car and both my sister and her husband's car to transport everything and all of us. We rented a beach house for a little over a week and had a great time. I was in the middle of a difficult point in my life, struggling with employment and being in between jobs. Having just started 2 new jobs, I was low on funds and worried about making my car payments on time. So I opted to head home 2 days early with my car to try and get more hours at work. My family expressed nervousness as I planned to leave after dinner and drive through the night to get home. I consoled them that I'd be okay to be up all night and that I'd head straight home, only stopping for gas and food as needed. I'm an excellent driver, a tad impatient, so I tend to go until I absolutely have to stop and take a break. However, this would be a 12-hour trip, and I knew I would need breaks, so I made a point of stopping every couple of hours just to stretch and walk around. The trip started off well. I had coffee to keep me awake, music and audiobooks to entertain me. After about 6 hours, I was in North Carolina, making great time. I made a pit stop for gas and a snack, then resumed the trip. By this point, it was around 1:30 a.m., and traffic was light. I was on a long, dark stretch of highway when I noticed the silhouette of something lying in the middle of the lane ahead of me. I slowed down to see it was a deer carcass. I drove around it, but as I passed, I noticed movement to my right. I saw a man standing just off the shoulder of the highway. I immediately felt a chill down my spine. I quickly accelerated, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. I saw the man slowly walk towards the middle of the highway and stand by the carcass, watching me drive away. I was spooked, but tried to convince myself it was just a hunter or someone checking on the deer. But deep down, I felt something was off. I decided to keep driving without stopping until I absolutely had to. About 2 hours later, I needed gas again, so I pulled into a brightly lit gas station off the highway. As I was filling up, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I glanced around but saw nothing unusual. I quickly finished, got back in my car, and continued driving. The rest of the trip was uneventful, but I couldn't stop thinking about the man standing by the deer carcass in the middle of the highway in the middle of the night. What was he doing there, and why did he watch me drive away? The encounter left me feeling uneasy for the remainder of my drive home. When I was 19, I was driving back home from college in my small Ford pickup. I was alone and had about 3 hours left in the trip, which meant I would arrive home around 2 a.m. I was used to driving long distances, so this wasn't unusual for me. About an hour into my drive, I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror coming up fast. I was on a 2-lane highway, so I moved over to the right lane to let the car pass. However, instead of passing, the car slowed down and stayed behind me. I found this a bit strange, but didn't think much of it. After about 15 minutes, the car was still tailing me, making me feel uneasy. I couldn't see the driver due to the glare of the headlights. I decided to slow down even more to encourage the car to pass, but it continued to match my speed. This went on for another 10 minutes. My anxiety grew with each passing moment. I then noticed a rest area sign up ahead and decided to pull in. I figured the driver might continue on the highway. As I pulled into the rest area, the car followed me. Now, I was genuinely scared. I parked my truck near the entrance of the rest area, close to the lights, and got out to stretch my legs, keeping an eye on the car. The car parked a few spaces away from me, and the driver didn't get out. I walked to the restroom, trying to stay calm. After a few minutes, I returned to my truck and saw the car still there. I quickly got in and drove off, hoping the car wouldn't follow me. But as soon as I got back on the highway, the car pulled out and resumed tailing me. I decided to call my dad, explaining the situation. He suggested I drive to the nearest police station. About 20 minutes later, I saw an exit sign for a small town with a police station. I took the exit, and the car followed. I drove straight to the police station, parked in front, and hurried inside. The car stopped at the entrance of the parking lot, then sped off into the night. I spoke with an officer who took down my information and assured me they would patrol the area. After waiting for a bit, I felt safe enough to continue my trip. I finally made it home without further incident, but the experience left me shaken. To this day, I wonder what the driver's intentions were and why they followed me for so long. I had to make a solo trip from Pennsylvania to Georgia to visit family. The trip was about 10 hours long, so I decided to drive through the night to avoid traffic. I made sure my car was in good condition, packed snacks, and planned to stop only for gas and bathroom breaks. The first few hours were uneventful. I had music and podcasts to keep me entertained, and traffic was light. By midnight, I was in Virginia and decided to stop at a rest area to stretch my legs and use the restroom. The rest area was well lit but nearly empty. There were a few trucks parked, but no other cars. I parked near the entrance, got out, and headed to the restroom. As I was walking back to my car, I noticed a man standing near the vending machines. He was staring at me intently, which made me feel uneasy. I quickly got back into my car, locked the doors, and drove off. As I continued driving, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw a pair of headlights far behind me. I tried to tell myself it was just another traveler, but the car seemed to be maintaining the same distance, neither gaining on me nor falling back. After an hour, I needed gas, so I pulled into a well-lit gas station. I noticed the same car pull in behind me. Trying to stay calm, I filled up my tank and went inside to pay. When I came back out, the man from the rest area was leaning against his car, staring at me again. Feeling a surge of panic, I quickly got in my car and sped off. The man followed me onto the highway. I decided to call my dad, explaining what was happening. He told me to drive to the nearest police station and stay on the line with him. I saw a sign for a town with a police station about 20 miles ahead. I took the exit and drove straight to the station, parking right in front. The man's car slowed down as it approached, then sped off when he saw where I had stopped. I went inside and spoke to an officer, who took down the details and assured me they would patrol the area. After waiting for a bit and feeling more at ease, I continued my journey. I arrived at my family's house safely, but the experience left me rattled. I still wonder what the man's intentions were and why he followed me for so long. About 3 weeks ago, my mom told my brother and me this story. Sally, a lifelong family friend, frequently visited her friends and family in Oklahoma. We live in a small town in southern Ontario, Canada, so Sally would drive straight 20 hours, at least overnight, to get from our town to another small town. She did this to save money and wanted to arrive as soon as possible. Now that you've heard the prelude, here's the story. About 30 years ago, she decided to head south for a visit. No big deal, she'd done this a few times before. So she packed up and headed out. After driving for about 14 or 15 hours, she started getting pretty tired. Being the 80s, it was a little safer, so she decided to stop at a rest stop for the night to get some sleep and resume again first thing in the morning. She parked in a very well-lit and busy rest stop, right by the lights, and felt at ease because there was an abundance of travelers stopping and going. She got out of her car for a bathroom break, came back, and settled in her car. About then, an RV pulled up beside her, and an elderly couple got out. The man asked her about coming from Canada. They struck up a little conversation. Nothing odd, the couple just talked to Sally for a bit. They told her that they were driving from the south going north and needed to sleep for the night. They wanted to talk because they were unsure if the rest stop was okay to stop at, but seeing as Sally was there, they felt at ease. They said goodnight and wished her a good trip, and the couple headed back to their RV. Sally locked her doors and went to sleep. 2 or 3 hours later, Sally woke up with a really unsettling feeling. She looked around. Nothing. A few people were going in and out of the stop. The parking lights were all on. She assumed she was just feeling bad because she was tired and her car wasn't the best place to sleep in. After 10 minutes, she said the feeling got worse, and it was a jarring, queasy, uneasy feeling. She sat back and tried to shrug it off. This didn't work, and apparently she had every red alarm and instinct telling her that she needed to go. She panicked, started her car, and peeled off. She didn't care where, she just knew that she needed to get away from there. About 20 miles down the road, she found a motel and gas station. She decided to see if she could get a room for what little money she had. She conversed with the person in charge, who cut her a deal because he didn't want to see a young woman driving alone late at night. She got a key, popped into her hotel room, and slept for the night. No issues whatsoever. Around 9 a.m., she woke up, showered, changed clothes, and decided to relax for a bit. She turned on the TV, and what she saw gave me chills. There was a breaking news story about an elderly couple who had been killed in the middle of the night. The news showed the RV that Sally was parked next to, in the exact same spot at the exact same stop. She even saw the fast food drink cup that she had dropped by accident, which had rolled under her car. Sometime during the night, a man broke into the RV and killed them, then simply left. Presumably, this all happened right before Sally had left. The man was never caught. Since then, Sally stopped at hotels for the night and avoided rest stops. This encounter took place several years ago in a remote part of the Australian Outback. For a bit of background, I'm a pretty built 6 feet 2 inches dude and was around 26 years old at the time. I was on a road trip with a mate, traveling around the central Queensland Outback in my old semi-reliable Nissan X-Trail. We're both massive science nerds and had heard about this amazing dinosaur trail out this way, which is essentially a grouping of 3 areas: Winton, Richmond, and Hendon, that have had previous dinosaur bone discoveries, still have fossils. And even a seriously awesome dinosaur track with preserved foot imprints. We were staying at a place 3 hours from Winton for a couple of days and were pretty keen to check out this trail, so we made the decision to do the 6-hour round trip in a day. We were pretty ambitious and stupid back then. We left at 9 a.m. The next morning, car packed with lunch, several liters of water, my trusty GPS, and off we went. It was a long drive, and halfway through, my air conditioner decided to conk out. If any of you live in or have visited Australia in the summer, you know that it's brutally hot, so you can imagine the 3-hour trip without air conditioning was hell. To make matters worse, my GPS also stopped working as the map software didn't recognize the area we were in. Luckily, I had an old Referdex in my back seat, but it was pretty tough to revert back to map reading when you're so used to a computer screen telling you where to go, especially given we were talking about the Australian Outback here, complete with dirt tracks for roads and very limited signage. But I digress. Finally, we made it to the trail and kicked around there for a couple of hours. Not going to lie, it was pretty awesome. Then we decided to make the trip back as it was starting to get later in the afternoon, and we didn't want to drive back in the dark. As we were about to leave, this gnarly old guy who appeared to be an employee of the trail company, dressed in all khaki camouflage gear, asked us about where we were from and where we were heading. He gave me the stink eye when I was vague with details, but my mate told him the name of the town we were staying at. He took a real liking to my mate and laughed when he told him about our lengthy journey. Apparently we had taken the long route, and there was a much quicker way back that would shave about an hour off our trip. We jumped at the directions he gave us, which were all verbal, and we wrote them down. Off we went on our merry way, thinking how lucky we were that we met this old dude who gave us some sweet intel on a shortcut home. But I can't deny there was a definite creepy vibe coming off him. Based on the directions he gave us, we went winding along several roads in an area I'd never been in and eventually settled straight back on a narrow dirt road. We were supposed to reach an intersection after about half an hour of driving, take a right, and continue on that road until we got to a main highway that would take us back. After about an hour and a half of driving on this dirt trail, though, we still hadn't reached the intersection. I was starting to freak out a bit, thinking we'd missed the turn, but my mate was completely chilled out and was sure that we'd get there eventually. I think he thought I was driving too slowly, but there are kangaroos out there, and they're dangerous if you hit one. We'd been traveling for quite a while now, and it was getting later and later in the day. It got to the point where the petrol in the tank was only a quarter full. There were no houses, other roads, or cars in sight, and I was really not comfortable with where this was headed, the middle of nowhere in a remote area in the wasteland that is the Australian Outback. There weren't any trees, only this dirt road and desolate dry bushland as far as the eye could see. I stopped the car and told my mate to get the binoculars out of the back to take a look around in case there were any landmarks. Yes, I carried binoculars in my car, and I still do. He obliges, and I can just make out a house-like structure not too far in the distance, so we made the decision to head for that. We figured it could be a house, and maybe the people would be nice enough to give us some petrol to top us up, and some better directions to get us out of there. As we neared this structure, it became apparent that this was no house at all. We pulled up out front and saw that it was an old caravan that had been burned to a shell from the inside out. It still had 3 blackened partial walls up, so we couldn't see all the way in. It looked like someone had been there recently because there were animal bones strung up all over the place and a cow skull at the entrance of the caravan. Some of the animal bone things even had grass or horsehair woven into them and were arranged like decorations. Then we saw this hand-painted sign that had been staked into the ground with the words Moonlight Motel written on it. My alarm bells were ringing loud and clear. I nudged my friend and said, "Let's get the hell out of here," but he was distracted by something in the distance. It was a car coming in the direction we had just come from. It must have only been 10 minutes behind us the entire time we were driving, but I didn't see it once. It was kicking up a ton of dust, which indicated that it was coming towards us fast. It was at this point we both heard a creepy scratching sound coming from the burned-out caravan, like someone scratching at the wall from the inside. I moved a little closer to try and see what it was, and there was a person in there peeking out at us from a hole in the damaged wall. Then this childlike voice that was obviously a grown man imitating a little girl giggled and said, "Are you here to play with me, my mate?" And I both looked at each other and booked it out of there, back into the inner sanctum of the X Trail. Just as I was about to reverse out, the other car stopped just behind my car with the high beams on. I couldn't see the driver, but they were in my way, so I couldn't reverse out of there. I had no choice but to drive forward and turn around that way, narrowly missing the Steak Motel sign. As we were turning to leave, the driver started to blare the horn, just hammering it for no reason at all. I just sped off back in the direction that we came, and thankfully the other car didn't follow. It was getting to twilight at this stage and pretty dangerous to be out on these country roads once it's dark because of the aforementioned kangaroo situation. But we were feeling a bit better as we managed to navigate our way back to where we came from, the Dino Trail, and even started to joke around about what happened. The person in the other car was probably just honking at us to get our attention to help with directions or something. I pulled into the parking lot and went to the front desk area of the company that runs the tours. I explained that we had gotten lost on the way back to the town we were staying at, and the lady there was kind enough to give us just enough petrol for the ride back. I couldn't help myself and mentioned to her that her workmate was a real jerk for giving us those weird directions. We figured there was no way that we could have messed up with the directions that he gave us. At this point, she gave me a weird look and asked if I could describe him. So I described him and her face went funny. She said, "That man doesn't work here. I saw him talking with the tourists today, and my boss had to ask him to leave. He kept trying to get the details of where people were staying and telling them that he had vacancies at his place and they could stay there at the Moonlight Motel. So to the creepy old dude who was pretending to give helpful directions to a couple of city folk to trap and potentially murder them in your lovely accommodation, let's not meet.